Welcome back everybody, this is GDS. Before we start this video, I want you to go to the blah blah below, that's the comments, and let me know what's the weirdest or coolest or most unique biome that you have run a single session or a whole campaign in. I want to hear your best ideas in the comments. This is a small channel, I don't get many comments, so if I see your comment, I'm gonna heart it, probably respond to it, so let's get a conversation going. Also, in case you don't know, we have a Discord server. Come join us in the nonsense below. There's going to be a link. It's a small community. I'll be there and I hope you will as well. As you might have guessed, this video is going to be about how to run a game in a distinct or unique biome/environment. To accomplish this, we're going to be using the fantasy goal mechanics schema that I identified in my video. The worst part of any TTRPG is actually playing it, and that's going to be either here or here. Again, I never remember. But just to give you a quick summary so you can keep watching this video, a fantasy is a set of feelings, ideas, and themes that are evoked when you think about something in particular. You'll see an example when I actually give 2 examples for biomes and flesh them out. Goals are things that we want to accomplish in our games that derive from our fantasies. You'll see examples for those as well. Mechanics are things that actually happen in the game that players interact with, that you interact with, that accomplish or fulfill the goals, which ultimately fulfill the fantasy. But before we go into any of that, I will say that I think a prerequisite to running a campaign or one session in a particular special, unique biome or environment is to have a robust survival and exploration system. The reason for that is if you don't have those systems, you can only describe things, in other words, tell, but the players never experience those things through their characters because they're not expressed in mechanics, so you can never show. Now, I'm not saying that show, don't tell is always correct, but in instances like these, when we fulfill fantasies and fulfill goals, we want that to be using mechanics, not only using narration. So let's go into our first example. We're going to go through fantasy, goals, and mechanics. The first one is going to be a frozen wasteland. So let's figure out the fantasy. Let's focus on feelings, concept, notions, and ideas that are evoked when you think about the frozen wasteland. One thing that I think about is that it's so cold outside that everyone has to use some kind of protective gear. Though I will say even with protective gear, you probably want to limit your exposure. One other thing we can add is maybe some kind of blizzard that comes in every so often that is extremely dangerous and cold, such that even if you have special equipment to survive the regular cold, the blizzard is lethal, so you have to find cover. Something else that comes to my mind when I think about a frozen wasteland is the different kind of rough or difficult terrain that you can encounter in such an environment. That could be something like hollow snow that you just step into and sink into, or something like thin layers of ice that crack under your feet, or maybe completely solid ice that's slippery and difficult to navigate, especially at a slope. Speaking of the environment, we can also have hidden ravines that crack into the ice. Maybe some of them crack as you try to walk over an area because you make it unstable. I'm also thinking that one of the most important things in this environment is going to be warmth. So whatever civilization exists probably huddles around some source of warmth. So in this world, just as an example, we can have geothermal activity, and civilization can exist around geothermal areas. Speaking of people, there are probably going to be creatures in this frozen wasteland as well. Probably not many of them because it's a wasteland, but the creatures that do exist must either have a way to keep warm or for one reason or another don't need to keep warm. For example, if they're machines or animal spirits or anything not physical, or that doesn't care about cold. So as you can tell, this is somewhat of a brainstorming session to identify the fantasy. I've made a list of stuff that generally comes up often, which you can use for your own reference. Usually, civilization comes up, which is how does civilization function in this biome? The second thing that comes up often in fantasy is animals. How do they survive and live? Also natural hazards. And finally, the players. How do they survive and explore that environment? How does that particular biome affect the way they do that? So those are our fantasies that we identified for the frozen wasteland. Just with that, we can narrate the players don't directly experience it. That's why we're going to further distill the fantasies into goals, things that we want to actually accomplish/fulfill. So our goals. One of the goals is definitely going to be that there is some necessity for a protective suit against the cold. Another goal is that journey length, the amount of time you spend outside of warm civilization, is going to be limited in time. You don't want to spend too much time outside in the cold because that's dangerous. Another goal is to have randomly occurring blizzards or ravines that open up that you can't predict if you're a player. Lastly, we want unique cold-themed creatures whose layers either provide warmth or make some kind of use of the environment. And because we said that civilization settles itself around geothermal activity, the size of each settlement is going to be limited by how many houses, how many businesses, how many farms and mills that geothermal area can support. These goals are good, they're useful, they tell us what we want to accomplish, but by themselves, it's not clear how, when you start a session, you actually use them. Like, what do you actually do? That's when mechanics come in, and that's the next part that we're going to do. For mechanics, make sure to focus on things that are directly relevant to the player experience, because those are the things that, well, players are actually going to experience. Which means these things are the things that players care about. So the first mechanic we're going to have is that the player characters will need to wear some kind of protective suit against the cold. And that suit can't be trivial, so it can't be something that you just equip once and then forget about it, because then players don't care about it, they never interact with it, you never show or tell about the cold because they forget it ever exists. So when I design this suit mechanic, perhaps it will restrict the movement of players in some way, or maybe as they use it day by day, it will accrue some kind of weariness on them, so they have to take it off. Something like that to make it so players have to manage the suit instead of putting it on and forgetting about it. The second thing about survival is when I design this biome with whatever exploration system and survival system I have in mind, the length of the journey is going to be limited to, say, 5 days because of the cold, resources, or anything like that. The third thing is about natural hazards. So a way I can accomplish this is having a random chart where every in-game week I roll to see if a blizzard rolls in. The fourth thing for a mechanic is I'm going to create some unique creatures that make use of the cold or have a particular way of keeping warm. For example, a dragon that uses its fire to keep itself warm. That makes sense. Or maybe small creatures that burrow into the snow and ice to avoid blizzards. Those creatures might also have an ability to, once burrowed, jump out at the players, and that can make for an interesting encounter. Maybe there are creatures that rely on eating a lot and being so massive that they maintain their body heat. Maybe because these creatures are so big, instead of being able to see, they rely on vibrations in the snow to locate their prey. These are just some examples of how you can make real, actual creatures in your game that make use of the environment. The last thing is, when I would create the map for this kind of game, I would map out which areas are geothermal, and I would make use of that when I put settlements in areas or civilization centers. I might even put ruins in places that used to exhibit geothermal activity, and as soon as that stopped, that area just died away. Along with dormant geothermal areas that used to house civilization, maybe there is a dormant volcano because, geothermal stuff. Maybe the volcano is not dormant, which is something the players can find out. Maybe there's a massive volcano crater, a caldera, and inside a frozen lake. There's a lot you can do with this. So that is the strategy I would take to run a game in a frozen wasteland. I would identify the fantasy. What kind of things come to mind when you think about frozen wasteland? 2, the goals. What kind of gameplay things do we want to fulfill? 3, what mechanics fulfill these goals? And that's it. Let's do one more example just for fun, and this one is going to be floating islands, because why not? Just to save you some time, let me read off my notes here. Let's be quick. Fantasy. The islands are suspended in the air, but they still have terrestrial structures like houses and roads, and maybe this is a steampunk world, So there might be factories and airfields. And because this is a steampunk world, when you look outside, you see probably not only the floating islands, but probably airships floating in the air. There are probably animals that are in some way adapted to this environment that are flying or floating around. And for people, there are special ways to travel across islands. Airships is probably one of them, and there may be more. Let's say for environmental hazards, every so often there is a high wind that, if you're caught in it, can carry you way off course, which is really dangerous, because if you only have fuel to get from point A to B and suddenly you're in point C, you might just sink into the bottomless abyss and die. But these air currents can also be useful if you want to get somewhere really fast, or maybe use an unconventional method of transportation that only works with an air channel. The final thing I would say that comes to my mind about floating islands, steampunk, fantasy is maybe there are some small islands that are unexplored, or maybe the bottom of the islands are not explored. So now goals. Islands should probably contain things players need to interact with, so players have a reason to go to islands. But also no one island should contain all the things the players need, so players need to travel around. That makes sense. That's part of our fantasy. We're definitely going to have airships as one way of transporting people and things. For animals, there are probably going to be lots of bird types flying around, but there might also be some gliding mammals and also some floating colonial organisms. Look up what a colonial organism is. It's really cool. For this setting, we can have maybe a large ribbon-looking thing that's a hollow tube that just uses the wind to float around and maybe feeds off of solar energy. Sounds cool to me. We can say that traveling between islands relies on air currents. There are some consistent air currents that are always there year-round, but some of them are maybe seasonal or even less reliable than that. We also know that unstable or surprising air currents can take you off course, and that there are small, unexplored islands, or maybe the bottom of the islands, something to explore. So now for mechanics, which is what are we actually going to do in the game? Airships are very expensive, and in our cyberpunk world, only the rich tycoons can afford them. So in order to get from place to place reliably, players will need to pay for tickets to board steampunk airships. But there are other ways to move around. For example, with the right air currents, maybe you can ride giant helicopter seeds to another island. Look up what helicopter seeds are. They're pretty cool. They're not giant in real life, but they could be in your fantasy world. Or maybe you can befriend your local birds and ride them to get to other islands using the right air currents. Maybe there are some secret ways to teleport between islands. When I design this, I'll come up with some concrete answers. And then for the air currents, speaking of, whenever players travel, perhaps the GM will roll on a random air current table that can take them off course, maybe take them faster in the current course. Maybe the GM will predetermine a bunch of air currents and roll to see which one of them are active. To fulfill the goal of having small islands, the GM, after making the main large islands, can just dot a bunch of small islands with ruins or other interesting things, maybe natural resources, on them. And then the last thing is, whatever creatures we design, they're going to have some kind of flying ability, because that's a prerequisite to living in this world. I hope these two examples excite you to run in a particular, unique, interesting biome or environment, and also help you to identify what you actually need to do to get from the idea to running it in the table. To summarize what you do, you start with a fantasy, the ideas, the notions, the feelings, the thoughts, the moments that come to mind when you think about this biome. And then you go to goals. Goals are the in general things that you want to accomplish that you feel like fulfill your fantasies. And then 3 is the mechanics. What actual concrete things that you and the players will interact with that will fulfill the goals that ultimately fulfill the fantasies. If you're still confused about what's a fantasy, what's a goal, what a mechanic is, I have a whole video about that, and that's going to be in the nonsense below. There's also a link to it earlier in this video. If you like this video, it's imperative that you smash your head into the like button and into the subscribe button an odd number of times, unless you're already subscribed. In that case, an even number of times will do. Let's go for 17 for the odd and just 2 for the even. Keep it simple. We also have a Discord channel. I know I already told you about it in the beginning of the video, but if you didn't hear me, I really want to see you and talk to you. Tell me what you think. Give me suggestions. I'm there. Everybody's there. It's a cool time. I hope you liked the video, and you might enjoy these other videos here. I don't know what they are, but I imagine you'll enjoy them. I'll see you later.